Tonight, we will explore the wisdom that emerges when we examine our attachments, not just to things, but to ways of thinking, to roles we play, to the very stories we tell ourselves about who we must be. There is nothing you need to do, nothing to fix, no one you need to become. Simply allow yourself to rest here in this moment as we discover together how freedom often lies not in holding tighter, but in learning when to let go. If this path calls to you, I invite you to subscribe and join us on this gentle journey toward understanding. Let your breath soften now. Feel your body supported by whatever holds you. Tonight, we will walk through stories of people who discovered that what they thought was protecting them was actually creating their suffering. We will see how a temple keeper, a young widow, a landowner, and others found their way from grasping to grace, from fear to freedom. Let us begin this journey together. Take a gentle breath and settle into stillness. Our first story unfolds in a temple where golden light should have danced, but instead, shadows lingered in corners where brightness belonged. There once lived a temple keeper named Madhav who tended the sacred oil lamps in a temple by the river. Each morning before dawn, he would climb the stone steps, unlock the heavy wooden doors, and enter the sanctuary where dozens of brass lamps waited to be lit. The temple was ancient, its walls carved with figures of dancing gods, its ceiling painted with stars that seemed to shimmer in lamplight. Madhav had been entrusted with this work by the head priest, and he took his responsibility seriously. Perhaps too seriously. The oil for the lamps came from donations, and there was never quite enough. Visitors would leave small coins, sometimes a rupee, occasionally more. But the oil merchants' prices seemed to rise with each passing month. As weeks turned to months, Madhav developed a system. Instead of filling each lamp completely, he would add just enough oil to create a small flame, enough to keep the lamps burning, but not enough to create the brilliant illumination the temple had once known. He reasoned that a dim light was better than no light at all, and this way the oil would last much longer. The temple, once famous for its golden glow that could be seen from across the river, grew dimmer. Visitors commented on the shadowy corners, the way the beautiful carvings seemed to disappear into darkness. But Madhav felt proud of his thriftiness. While other temples might run out of oil entirely, his lamps never went completely dark. One evening, as Madhav was carefully measuring oil into each lamp, just a small amount, just enough, an old priest appeared beside him. Madhav had not heard him approach. The priest was thin and bent with age, his white beard reaching nearly to his chest, his eyes bright despite their many wrinkles. "Good evening, keeper," the priest said softly. Madhav looked up, startled. "Good evening, father. I did not hear you enter." "I have been watching you work," the priest said, settling himself on the stone floor beside the row of lamps. "You are very careful with the oil." Madhav felt a flush of pride. "Yes, father. I make sure never to waste a single drop. These lamps have burned continuously for 3 months now." The priest nodded slowly, looking around the dim sanctuary. The carved figures on the walls seemed to peer out from shadows, their details lost in the half-light. "Tell me," the priest said, "what is the purpose of oil?" Madhav blinked. The question seemed so obvious. "To burn, father, to fuel the flames." "Ah," the priest said. "And what is the purpose of flames?" "To give light." "Yes." The priest was quiet for a moment, watching Madhav's careful measuring. "And what is the purpose of light?" Madhav paused, his small measuring cup halfway to a lamp. To illuminate the temple, to honor the gods, to welcome devotees." Indeed. The priest gestured toward the dim corners, the shadowed walls. And tell me, child, is this temple illuminated? Madhav looked around, really looked, perhaps for the first time in months. The magnificent carvings were barely visible. The golden ceiling, painted with such care by artists long dead, was lost in darkness. Pilgrims had to strain their eyes to see the altar, had to feel their way along the walls. It is somewhat illuminated, Father. Somewhat. The priest picked up one of Madhav's oil containers, feeling its weight. You have been storing oil for weeks, I think, saving it. Yes, Father, to make it last. And how long do you plan to make it last? Madhav shifted uncomfortably. Well, as long as possible. Forever, if I can manage it. The priest was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was gentle, like a father speaking to a confused child. Madhav, if you save the oil forever, when will the temple be bright? The question hung in the air like incense smoke. Madhav opened his mouth to answer, then closed it. He looked at the dim lamps, then at the container of oil he had been hoarding, then back at the priest. I don't understand, Father. The priest smiled. Let me ask you this. If a man receives medicine for his illness but refuses to take it, saving it for the future, when will he be healed? He won't be, Madhav said immediately. The medicine only works if you use it. Yes, and if a farmer saves all his seeds, never planting them, when will he have a harvest? Never, Madhav said, his voice growing quieter. And if an oil lamp keeper saves all his oil, never burning it fully, when will the temple be illuminated? Madhav sat back on his heels, the measuring cup forgotten in his hands. Around him, the small flames flickered weakly, casting more shadows than light. Never, he whispered. The priest nodded. The oil's purpose is not to be stored, child. Its purpose is to be transformed, from liquid to flame, from flame to light, from light to illumination. When you prevent this transformation, you prevent the oil from fulfilling its nature. Madhav looked at the row of lamps, each one burning with its careful, measured flame. He thought of all the evenings when devotees had squinted in the dimness, when pilgrims had commented on how dark the temple had become, when he had felt secretly proud of his economy. But Father, he said, if I burn the oil generously, it will run out. What then? The priest was quiet for a moment, listening to the soft sound of the river outside the temple walls. Tell me, Madhav, in all your months of careful saving, has more oil appeared? Madhav frowned. I don't understand. You have been saving oil for months. The lamps burn dimly but continuously. Has your store of oil grown larger because of your thriftiness? No, Father. It has grown smaller, just more slowly. So your saving has not prevented the oil from being consumed. It has only prevented it from creating light. Madhav stared at the priest, something shifting in his chest like a stone rolling away from a cave entrance. And tell me, the priest continued, when devotees come to a bright temple, filled with golden light and dancing shadows, what do? They make offerings. They leave donations. Yes, and when they come to a dim temple, where they can barely see the beauty around them, where the sacred space feels forgotten and neglected, what do? Madhav's heart sank. They leave quickly, and they don't return. So your attempt to make the oil last longer has actually ensured that less oil will come. The truth of this hit Madhav like a physical blow. He had been so focused on preserving what he had that he had forgotten why he had it in the first place. The oil was not meant to be saved. It was meant to be transformed into something greater than itself. Father, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think I have been very foolish." The priest reached over and gently took the measuring cup from Madhav's hands. Then he picked up the container of oil, and before Madhav could protest, began pouring generous amounts into each lamp. The flames leaped higher immediately, as if they had been holding their breath. Light began to chase away shadows that had lived in corners for months. The carved figures on the walls seemed to come alive, their faces emerging from darkness. The painted ceiling began to glow, stars and suns and moons appearing as if by magic. Madhav watched, transfixed. The temple was transformed. This was how it was meant to look, how it had looked when his predecessor had tended the lamps, how it should always look. "But the oil will run out faster now," he said weakly. The priest smiled. "Yes, and what then?" "We will need more." "And how will we get more?" Madhav looked around the brilliantly lit temple, at the way the light danced on the walls, at how the space had become welcoming and alive again. "People will come," he said slowly. "They will see the beauty. They will want to contribute. They will give offerings. Yes, the oil will be consumed, and more oil will come. This is the natural cycle, but only if you allow the oil to fulfill its purpose." The priest stood, his old joints creaking softly. Resources hoarded out of fear serve no one. Resources used for their intended purpose create abundance. Madhav remained sitting by the lamps, watching the bright flames dance. For months, he had congratulated himself on his wisdom, his careful stewardship, his ability to make things last. But he had been like a man who hoards water while his garden dies, who saves seeds while his fields lie fallow, who keeps medicine in the bottle while illness spreads. "Father," he called as the priest moved toward the temple entrance. "What if people don't come? What if the donations don't increase? What if the oil runs out and there is no more?" The priest paused at the doorway, his figure silhouetted against the starlit sky. "Then the lamps will go dark," he said simply, "and you will light them again when oil comes. But tell me, child, is it better to have a temple that shines brilliantly for 1 month and then goes dark, or a temple that glimmers dimly for 3 months and never truly illuminates anything?" Madhav thought of all the devotees who had come during his careful months, who had seen only shadows where they expected light, who had left disappointed, who had not returned. "The brilliant month," he said quietly. "Yes, because in that brilliant month, the temple serves its purpose. It welcomes seekers, it honors the divine, it creates beauty in the world. In the dim months, it serves only your fear." The priest disappeared into the night, leaving Madhav alone with the dancing flames. This story shows us how fear of scarcity can prevent us from experiencing abundance. Madhav discovered that resources withheld from their purpose serve no purpose at all. Buddhism teaches that attachment born from fear often creates the very lack we are trying to avoid. When we hoard what we have, whether material resources, love, attention, or energy, out of fear that there won't be enough, we prevent the natural flow that actually creates abundance. Let us pause here for a moment. Notice your breath moving in and out, requiring no effort from you. Feel your body supported, held by whatever surface rests beneath you. There is nothing you need to do right now except simply be here with these words, with these stories that unfold like lotus petals in still water. Our next story takes us to a different kind of attachment, where a young woman faced a choice between honoring the past and embracing the future, learning that love takes many forms across a lifetime. In a small village where the houses clustered together like birds in winter, there lived a young woman named Kavita, whose husband had died in an accident during their first year of marriage. She was only 22, with dark eyes that had once sparkled with laughter, but now seemed to hold too much sorrow for someone so young. According to the customs of her village, Kavita should wear only white saris, remove her jewelry, and live quietly in her in-laws' home for the rest of her life. She should devote herself to her late husband's memory, tend his photograph with daily prayers, and never think of remarriage. This was the way it had always been done, the way proper wives honored their departed husbands. For 2 years, Kavita followed these customs faithfully. She rose before dawn to light incense before her husband's photograph, cooked for his family, kept house, and spoke little. Her own family visited rarely. She belonged to her husband's family now, even in death. Her in-laws were not unkind, but they made it clear that any deviation from tradition would shame her husband's memory and bring dishonor to their house. But as the seasons turned and Kavita's 24th birthday approached, something stirred in her heart. She would see young couples walking together in the market, would hear children laughing in the streets, would watch the sun set over fields where farmers worked alongside their wives, and feel a longing so sharp it made her catch her breath. She began to wonder, was this really what her husband would have wanted for her? Ravi had been kind, gentle, full of dreams about the life they would build together. Would he truly want her to spend the next 50 years in mourning, her life as ended as his? These thoughts troubled her, and she tried to push them away. But they persisted, growing stronger with each passing day, like seeds that continue to grow even in poor soil. One evening, as Kavita was preparing dinner, she overheard her sister-in-law talking to a neighbor woman. "I worry about Kavita," the sister-in-law was saying. "She seems restless lately. Yesterday I caught her looking at her old jewelry. I fear she might be having improper thoughts." "You must watch her carefully," the neighbor replied. "Young widows are prone to shameful desires. If she dishonors your brother's memory, it will reflect on your entire family." Kavita's hands trembled as she stirred the doll. She had only been looking at her wedding jewelry because it reminded her of the happy girl she had once been, not because she was planning anything improper. But even this innocent remembrance was being interpreted as betrayal. That night, she lay on her simple cot in the small room she had shared with Ravi, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the house settling into sleep. On the wall, her husband's photograph looked down at her in the moonlight, his young face frozen in the formal expression all wedding portraits seem to require. "What should I do?" she whispered to the photograph. "I loved you, Ravi. I still love you, but I am so lonely." The photograph, of course, did not answer. Days passed, and Kavita's internal struggle deepened. She had met a man, the village school teacher, a widower himself with a young daughter who needed a mother. His wife had died in childbirth 3 years earlier. His name was Mohan, and he was kind and gentle, with patient eyes and a way of speaking to his daughter that made Kavita's heart ache with memory and possibility. They had spoken only briefly at the market about his daughter's need for a female figure in her life, about Kavita's own loss, about the difficulties of living with grief. Nothing improper had been said, nothing that violated custom. But Kavita felt understood in a way she had not felt since Ravi's death. When Mohan quietly suggested, through a mutual friend, that perhaps they might consider marrying, two wounded people helping to heal each other, a fatherless child gaining a mother, a childless woman gaining a daughter, Kavita's in-laws were scandalized. "How dare you even consider such a thing?" her mother-in-law demanded. Have you no respect for my son's memory? A proper wife mourns for life. To even think of another man is to spit on Ravi's grave." "But I would not love him less," Kavita tried to explain. "My heart has room for both." "Nonsense," her father-in-law interrupted. "Love is not something to be divided like rice at a feast. If you marry another, you make our son's love meaningless." The family held meetings. Relatives were consulted. The village elders were asked their opinion. Everyone agreed. Kavita's desire to remarry was selfish, shameful, a betrayal of everything decent wives should represent. "Think of what people will say," her sister-in-law pleaded. "Think of the example you set for other young wives. If widows start remarrying whenever they feel lonely, what will become of devotion? What will become of honor?" Kavita felt crushed under the weight of their disapproval. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps her loneliness was selfish. Perhaps wanting a companion, wanting children, wanting a full life, was indeed a betrayal of her dead husband's love. But late at night, when the house was quiet, she would remember Ravi's gentle nature, his kindness to everyone he met, his dreams for their future together. Would such a man really want her to live in shadows for the rest of her life? The conflict within her grew so intense that she could barely eat, barely sleep. She began to lose weight, to move through her days like a ghost. Her in-laws, seeing her distress, felt vindicated in their position. Clearly, her improper thoughts were making her ill, as improper thoughts should. It was during this dark period that a wandering monk came to the village. He was not young, but not yet old, with the kind of face that seemed to have absorbed much sorrow and transformed it into compassion. He sat up under the great banyan tree in the village center and began to teach whoever would listen. Kavita, desperate for any guidance, slipped out of the house one evening to hear him speak. She stayed at the back of the small crowd, her white sari making her nearly invisible in the gathering dusk. The monk was talking about attachment, about the ways we cling to roles and identities that may no longer serve us or others. His voice was gentle but clear, carrying across the small gathering like water over stones. "We often confuse loyalty with stagnation," he was saying. "We think that to honor what was, we must refuse what is and what might be. But life is movement, change, the endless dance of arising and passing away." After the talk, as the crowd dispersed, Kavita found herself approaching the monk. Her hands shook as she pressed them together in greeting. "Teacher," she said softly, "I have a question that troubles me greatly." The monk looked at her with kind eyes. "Please, child, share your burden." Kavita glanced around to make sure no one from her husband's family was near, then poured out her story, her young marriage, her husband's death, her loneliness, the possibility of remarriage, her family's anger, her own confusion about what honor and loyalty truly required. The monk listened without interruption, occasionally nodding, his face reflecting deep compassion for her struggle. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, looking up at the stars that were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "Tell me," he said finally, "if you had a beautiful oil lamp that brought light and warmth to your home, and that lamp went out, what would you do?" Kavita frowned, not understanding the relevance of the question. I would light another lamp, teacher." "Ah, and would lighting the new lamp be disrespectful to the first lamp?" "No, of course not. The first lamp served its purpose. The new lamp would simply continue providing light." "Yes, and if you chose instead to sit in darkness out of loyalty to the first lamp, would that honor its service?" Kavita thought for a moment. "No, it would make the first lamp's service meaningless. Lamps are meant to create light, not to be mourned in darkness." The monk smiled gently. You are wise, child. Now tell me, what is the purpose of marriage? To create companionship, to build a life together, to support each other, to create family if possible. Indeed. And when a marriage ends in death, does the love that was shared become less real? No, Kavita said quietly. The love remains. It becomes part of who you are. Yes. So if you were to marry again, would that diminish the love you shared with your first husband? Kavita felt something loosening in her chest, like a knot that had been tied too tightly for too long. No, it would not. It would be a different love, built on the foundation of what I learned from the first love. And would your first husband's love have been wasted if it taught you how to love again? How to be a good wife to another? How to be a mother to a child who needs one? Tears began to flow down Kavita's cheeks. No, it would mean his love had borne fruit, had created something beautiful, even after his death. The monk reached into his simple bag and pulled out a small oil lamp. He lit it with a match, and the flame danced in the evening air. Watch, he said, and blew out the flame. They sat in darkness for a moment. Then he struck another match and relit the lamp. Did the second flame dishonor the first? He asked. No, Kavita whispered. Did the first flame's light become less beautiful because a second flame now burns? No. And if I were to light 100 lamps from this one, would any of them diminish the beauty of the original light? No. They would spread the light further. The monk handed her the lamp. Your first marriage was like this flame, beautiful, warming, bringing light to your life. That it ended in death does not make it less beautiful, but choosing to live in darkness afterward does not honor that light. It wastes it. Kavita held the lamp carefully, watching the flame dance in the gentle night breeze. But teacher, she said, my husband's family says that remarriage shows I did not truly love him. They say a faithful wife mourns forever. The monk was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. Tell me, child, if your husband could speak to you now, what do you think he would say? Not what others think he should want, but what you, who knew him best, believe he would truly want for you. Kavita closed her eyes, remembering Ravi's gentle nature, his kindness, his love of life and laughter. He would want me to be happy, she said softly. He would want me to live fully, to love again, to have the children we dreamed of together. He would not want me to waste my life in mourning. Yes, and would such a man be honored more by your lifelong sorrow, or by your ability to take the love he gave you and share it with others who need it? By sharing the love, Kavita said, understanding flooding through her like sunrise after a long night. The deepest way to honor a flame that has gone out is not to sit in darkness, but to light new flames. The deepest way to honor a love that has ended in death is not to close your heart forever, but to let that love teach you how to love again. Kavita sat holding the lamp, feeling something she had not felt in 2 years. Peace. The guilt that had been eating at her heart began to dissolve. She saw now that her desire for companionship was not betrayal, but a testament to what Ravi had taught her about the beauty of sharing life with another person. But, teacher, she said, what about the customs? What about what people will say? What about bringing shame on my husband's family? The monk smiled gently. There is a difference between honoring tradition and being imprisoned by it. Some customs serve life and love. Others serve only fear and the comfort of familiar suffering. Wisdom lies in knowing which is which. He stood, gathering his simple belongings. Your first husband is gone, child, but you are still here. Your life continues. The question is not whether you will honor his memory. Anyone who knew you could see that you will carry him in your heart always. The question is whether you will honor your own life, your own capacity for love, your own right to happiness. As the monk disappeared into the darkness, Kavita sat alone under the banyan tree, holding the lamp and thinking. She thought of Mohan's little daughter, who needed a mother's care. She thought of the school children who could benefit from a teacher whose wife helped with their studies. She thought of her own longing for children, for companionship, for a life lived fully rather than half-lived in sorrow. Most of all, she thought of Ravi and what he had taught her about love, that it was generous, not possessive, that it wanted the beloved's happiness above all else, that it sought to create life and joy, not preserve sorrow. If he could speak to her now, she knew what he would say. Live, Kavita. Love again. Be happy. That would honor me more than a lifetime of tears. This story shows us how honoring the past doesn't require sacrificing the future. Kavita discovered that love is not diminished by sharing it, but multiplied. Buddhism teaches that attachment to fixed roles and identities often prevents us from responding appropriately to life's changing circumstances. When we confuse loyalty with stagnation, we may actually dishonor what we claim to protect by refusing to let it bear fruit in new forms. Take a gentle breath now. Feel the air moving naturally through your body, requiring no effort, no control. Notice how each breath is both like every breath that came before and completely unique. This is the nature of all life, continuity and change dancing together in perfect harmony. Our next story takes us to a mango orchard, where a landowner learned that protecting what we have sometimes requires sharing it, and that communities built on scarcity protect no one when true need arises. Beyond the village, where the river curved through farmland like a silver snake through green cloth, lived a man named Panu, who owned the largest mango orchard for miles around. The trees were ancient and generous, their branches heavy with fruit each summer, their leaves providing cool shade even in the hottest months. Bhanu had inherited this orchard from his father, who had inherited it from his father before him. 3 generations of careful tending had made it legendary in the region. People would travel from distant villages just to taste the mangoes, which were sweet as honey and large as a man's hand. But Panu, unlike his father and grandfather, was a man possessed by the fear of loss. Perhaps it was because he had struggled in his youth, working in the city before returning to claim his inheritance. Perhaps it was because he had seen how quickly prosperity could disappear. Whatever the reason, he guarded his orchard like a fortress guards its treasures. The trees, being generous by nature, produced more fruit than could ever be sold at market. Each day during mango season, dozens of ripe mangoes would fall to the ground, too soft for transport, but perfectly good for eating. In previous generations, the villagers had been welcome to collect these fallen fruit. Children would run beneath the trees in the early morning, filling their shirts with mangoes for breakfast. Poor families would gather enough to make preserves that would last through the lean months. But Panu had put an end to this practice. He built a wall around the orchard and posted signs warning against trespassers. He hired a guard to patrol the grounds, ensuring that every mango stayed within his property lines, whether on the tree or on the ground. "They are my mangoes," he would tell anyone who questioned his policy. "My trees, my land, my fruit. If people want mangoes, they can buy them at the market." And so the fallen fruit rotted where it lay, becoming food for insects, and eventually fertilizer for the soil, while in the village, children went without fresh fruit, and families could afford only the smallest, most bruised mangoes from the market vendors. Bhanu felt proud of his stern management. Other landowners called him foolish for letting good fruit go to waste. But he saw it differently. He was establishing boundaries, teaching respect for property, ensuring that no one took advantage of his generosity. Better to waste fruit than to encourage the kind of dependency that weakened both giver and receiver. His neighbors, who had once considered him a friend, began to avoid him. When they passed his orchard and smelled the sweet scent of rotting mangoes, they would shake their heads but say nothing. What was the use? Bhanu had made his position clear. The seasons turned. Mango harvest came and went. Bhanu's profits were good. He lost nothing to theft, nothing to unauthorized gleaning. His accounting was precise, his inventory complete. He congratulated himself on his business acumen. But in the third year of this policy, Bhanu's son Arshan fell ill with a fever that would not break. The boy, only 8 years old, burned with heat and could keep no food down. The village doctor examined him and shook his head gravely. "He needs medicine that I cannot provide," the doctor told Bhanu. "There is a specialist in the city, but his treatment is expensive, very expensive." Bhanu's heart clenched with fear. How expensive? The doctor named a sum that made Bhanu's breath catch. It was more than his orchard earned in 2 seasons, more than his savings could cover, more than he could possibly raise by selling fruit. "Surely there is some other way," Bhanu pleaded. "Not that I know of," the doctor replied sadly. "Without this treatment, the fever may worsen. I am sorry." That night, Bhanu sat by his son's bedside, listening to the boy's labored breathing, watching his small chest rise and fall with effort. For the first time in years, Bhanu's thoughts were not on his orchard, his profits, his careful boundaries. All he could think about was his child's need. The next morning, swallowing his pride, Bhanu began visiting his neighbors. Surely they would understand a father's desperation. Surely they would lend him money for such a cause. He went first to the blacksmith, a man he had known since childhood. "Rajan," Bhanu said, his voice humble for the first time in years. "My son is very ill. I need to borrow money for medicine. I can pay you back after the next harvest." The blacksmith looked at him for a long moment, then shook his head. "I'm sorry, Bhanu. I have no money to spare." This was clearly untrue. Rajan's smithy was busy, his family well-fed and well-clothed, but Bhanu was in no position to argue. He tried the grain merchant next, then the cloth dealer, then the tea shop owner. Each gave him the same response: no money available for lending. Growing desperate, Bhanu approached families he had known for decades, people whose children had once played with his son, people who had been guests at his wedding. "Please," he begged, "it's for Arshan. He's only a child." But door after door closed to him. People who clearly had money to spare claimed poverty. People who had once called him friend now treated him like a stranger. Finally, in desperation, Bhanu approached an old woman named Kamala, who lived in a small house at the edge of the village. She was a widow who survived on a tiny pension and the vegetables from her kitchen garden. If anyone truly had no money to spare, it was she. But perhaps, he thought, she would at least speak to him kindly, would at least acknowledge his suffering even if she could not help. Kamala invited him inside and offered him tea, which he accepted gratefully. She listened as he explained his situation, his son's illness, his need for money, the doors that had been closed to him. When he finished, she sat quietly for a moment, stirring her tea. "You know," she said finally, "my grandson loves mangoes. Love them, I should say. He used to run to your orchard every morning during mango season, hoping to find fallen fruit beneath the trees." Bhanu shifted uncomfortably. "The fruit on my land belongs to me." "Oh yes," Kamala agreed. "Absolutely. Just as the money in my neighbors' purses belongs to them." Bhanu looked up sharply. "You see," Kamala continued, her voice gentle but firm, "you taught us something important these past years. You taught us that need doesn't create obligation. You taught us that just because someone asks doesn't mean we must give. You taught us that our resources are ours alone, to guard and protect from anyone who might want to share in them." The words hit Bhanu like physical blows. "But this is different," he protested. "This is my child's life." "Ah," said Kamala. "Just as those mangoes were children's hunger, just as that fruit was family's nourishment. But you were right. Need doesn't create obligation." She stood and moved to her window, looking out at her small garden. "I remember your father," she said softly. "During the drought year, when my husband was dying and I had no money for medicine, your father came to my door with a basket of mangoes and a bag of rice. He said, 'In times of trouble, we help each other. That's what makes us a community.'" Bhanu's throat tightened. "Your grandfather was the same way," she continued. "When the floods came and washed away the bridge, he organized the men to rebuild it, though it benefited his orchard least of all. He said, 'What helps my neighbors helps me, even if I can't see how.'" She turned back to Bhanu, her old eyes bright with wisdom. "But you taught us a better way," she said. "You taught us that each person should look after only himself, that sharing makes people weak and dependent, that boundaries matter more than bonds." Bhanu wanted to protest, to explain that his situation was different, that a child's life was more important than fallen fruit. But the words died in his throat as he realized the terrible logic of what he was hearing. "We learned well," Kamala said gently. "Perhaps too well." Bhanu stumbled out of her house and walked slowly back toward his own, his heart heavy with more than just fear for his son. For the first time, he saw his orchard not as a fortress to be defended, but as something that could have been part of the village's abundance, something that could have woven him more deeply into the fabric of community care. He thought of his father and grandfather, who had understood something he had forgotten, that in a community, individual prosperity and communal well-being were not competing interests, but complementary ones, that what helped his neighbors did help him, even when the connection was not immediately visible. That evening, as he sat again by his son's bedside, Bhanu made a decision. He would sell his orchard if necessary to pay for the medicine. He would find the money somehow, even if it meant losing everything. But first, he had something else to do. The next morning, Bhanu did something he had not done in 3 years. He unlocked the gate to his orchard and left it open. Then he walked through the village, stopping at every house. "The mangoes are falling," he announced simply. "Anyone who wants them is welcome to come." Some people ignored him, still hurt by years of rejection. But others, especially those with children, made their way to the orchard. They filled baskets with the fallen fruit, sweet and ripe and free. Bhanu worked alongside them, helping children reach the best mangoes, showing families where the sweetest varieties grew. For the first time in years, his orchard was full of laughter and community joy. As the day progressed, something unexpected happened. People began approaching him, not to take, but to give. "I heard about Arshan," said the blacksmith, pressing money into Bhanu's hand. "This might help." "For the medicine," said the grain merchant, adding his contribution. Others followed, each offering what they could. By evening, Bhanu had enough money for his son's treatment, with some left over. But the greater gift was the understanding that bloomed in his heart like a mango tree in spring. He had thought that protecting what was his required building walls around it. He had forgotten that the strongest protection comes from being part of something larger than oneself. A community that cares for all its members because it knows that individual suffering diminishes everyone, and individual joy lifts everyone up. This story shows us that communities without mutual care protect no one. Bhanu discovered that hoarding resources out of fear actually weakens the very security he sought to create. Buddhism teaches that the illusion of separation, the belief that mine and yours are absolute categories, blinds us to our fundamental interdependence. When we act from the understanding that individual and communal well-being are inseparably connected, we create true security for ourselves and others. Let your breathing soften now. Notice how your breath connects you to all life. The oxygen you take in was given by trees and plants. The carbon dioxide you release nourishes them in return. Even this simple act of breathing reveals the truth of interconnection, the way individual life is always held within the larger web of existence. Our fourth story takes us into the workshop of a potter, where a young apprentice discovered that criticism of work is not rejection of worth, and that the hardest teacher might offer the greatest gift. In a workshop that smelled of clay and wood smoke, where the potter's wheel spun like a prayer wheel turning toward truth, there worked a master potter named Daksh and his apprentice, a young man called Jay, who had come to learn the ancient craft. Jay was 18, eager to master the wheel, ambitious to create vessels as beautiful as those his master produced. He had watched Daksh's hands move over clay like water over stones, had seen rough earth transform into bowls and cups and vases of startling elegance. This was what he wanted to learn, not just the technique, but the magic. But from his first day in the workshop, Jay felt the weight of constant correction. "No," Daksh would say, watching Jay's hands on the clay. "Your pressure is uneven. The wall will collapse. No, you're forcing it. Let the clay tell you what it wants to become. No, that rim is too thick. Start again." Nothing Jay did seemed to satisfy his master. Every pot he attempted was criticized, corrected, or rejected entirely. Even when Jay thought he had created something beautiful, Daksh would point out flaws that Jay had not noticed. Slight wobbles in the base, irregularities in the wall thickness, rims that were not quite centered. Day after day, week after week, Jay's efforts met with the same response: not good enough. Try again. Start over. The other villagers who came to buy pottery would praise Daksh's work lavishly, but Jay noticed they rarely even looked at his attempts. When they did, it was often with polite but unenthusiastic comments. "Very nice, young man. You're learning." Jay began to feel that his master took pleasure in humiliating him. Surely some of his pots were adequate, even if not masterful. Surely some encouragement would help him improve faster than this endless criticism. He began to watch the way Daksh interacted with customers, noting how warm and friendly the older man could be when selling his wares, how patiently he would explain the firing process or the properties of different clays. With others, Daksh was a patient teacher, a gracious host. Only with Jay did he seem harsh and impossible to please. The young man's resentment grew like a weed in fertile soil. He began to suspect that his master was jealous of his youth, fearful that his apprentice might one day surpass him. determined to keep Jay from succeeding. "He doesn't want me to learn properly," Jay complained to his friend Suresh one evening. "He wants to keep me dependent on him, always the inferior apprentice. If he actually taught me well, I might become competition." Suresh, who knew little about pottery but much about wounded pride, agreed enthusiastically. "You should leave," he advised. "Find another master, or better yet, set up your own workshop. You've been there 8 months. Surely you've learned enough to start working independently." The idea took root in Jay's mind. Why should he continue to endure daily humiliation when he could be creating and selling his own work? He had watched Daksha's techniques carefully. He understood the basics of clay preparation, of wheel work, of glazing and firing. How difficult could it be? After a particularly harsh day, when Daksh had made him remake the same bowl 4 times, Jay made his decision. "Master," he said, trying to keep his voice respectful, "I think it's time for me to leave your workshop." Daksh looked up from the pot he was trimming, his hands never pausing in their work. "Oh? And why is that?" "I feel ready to work on my own. I've learned much here, and I'm grateful, but I think I need to develop my own style, to find my own way." This was partially true, but the deeper truth, that Jay felt constantly criticized and never good enough, remained unspoken. Daksh studied him for a long moment. "I see. And where will you work?" "Suresh's uncle has offered to let me use a corner of his courtyard. I can build a small kiln there." "Ah." Daksh returned to his trimming. "Well then, I wish you success." That was all. No argument, no attempt to persuade him to stay, no acknowledgement of their months together. Jay felt both relieved and oddly disappointed. Had his leaving meant so little? Within a week, Jay had set up his makeshift workshop. Suresh helped him build a small kiln and acquire basic tools. Jay bought clay from the same supplier Daksh used and set about creating his first independent works. The freedom was intoxicating. No one stood over him pointing out flaws. No one made him start over when he was satisfied with his work. He could create whatever pleased him, fire it when he felt ready, and call it finished when it looked good to his own eyes. His first pieces came off the wheel easily. Without Daksha's critical voice in his ear, Jay found his hands moved with new confidence. He created bowls and cups, even attempting a few decorative vases. To his own eyes, they looked quite good. Not as refined as Daksha's work, perhaps, but respectable for a young potter striking out on his own. He fired his first kiln load with great anticipation, inviting Suresh to witness the moment when the kiln door was opened and his independent career would truly begin. But when they lifted the fired pieces from the kiln, Jay's heart sank. Half the pots had cracked during firing, long splits that ran from rim to base, making them completely unusable. Of those that survived intact, several had warped badly, their once round shapes now oval or lopsided. The glazes he had applied had run in places and failed to cover properly in others, creating ugly bare patches and thick drips. "They're not quite what I expected," Jay admitted to Suresh, trying to hide his disappointment. "Well, it's your first firing alone," Suresh said encouragingly. "You'll do better next time." Jay loaded another kiln, being more careful with his glazing, adjusting the clay preparation based on what he thought had gone wrong. But the second firing was no better than the first. More cracks, more warping, more glaze failures. By the fourth firing, Jay was forced to admit a painful truth. His pots were terrible. Not just imperfect or amateur, they were genuinely bad, the kind of work that even charitable neighbors would refuse as gifts. He tried to analyze what was going wrong. The clay seemed different when he worked it, somehow less cooperative than it had been in Daksha's workshop. His wheel technique, which had felt adequate under supervision, now seemed clumsy and uncertain. Glazes that he had seen applied dozens of times behaved unpredictably when he tried to use them. Worst of all, he was beginning to see flaws in his work that he had never noticed before. Bowls that looked round on the wheel revealed themselves as subtly lopsided when fired. Walls that seemed smooth showed fingerprint impressions after glazing. Rims that appeared centered displayed slight wobbles when the pot was completed. It was as if leaving Daksha's workshop had given him new eyes that could suddenly see all the imperfections he had been blind to before. After 2 months of failures, Jay swallowed his pride and walked back to his former master's workshop. He found Daksh at the wheel, centered and calm as always, his hands moving over clay with the same fluid grace Jay remembered. "Master," Jay said quietly. Daksh looked up but didn't stop working. "Jay, how is your independent practice going?" There was no mockery in the question, no satisfaction at Jay's obvious defeat, just genuine inquiry. "Not well," Jay admitted. I think I left too soon. My work it's terrible." "Ah." Daksh continued shaping the vessel on his wheel. "What makes it terrible?" "Everything. The pots crack, they warp, the glazes don't work. I thought I understood what you were teaching me, but clearly I didn't understand anything." Daksh was quiet for a moment, his hands guiding the clay walls higher. "Tell me," he said finally. "What do you think I was doing wrong as your teacher?" The question surprised Jay. He had expected to be asked what he had done wrong, not what his master had done wrong. "You were very critical," Jay said carefully. "You pointed out every flaw, made me start over constantly, never seemed satisfied with anything I made." "Yes. And how did that make you feel?" "Frustrated, angry, like I was never good enough, like you didn't believe in me." Daksh nodded, lifting the finished pot from the wheel and setting it aside to dry. "And now, working alone, how do you feel about your pots?" "Like they're disasters, like I don't know anything about pottery at all." "Interesting." Daksh cleaned his hands and turned to face Jay directly. "So when I criticized your work, you felt I was being too harsh. But when you don't criticize your own work enough, the clay shows you the truth anyway." Jay frowned, not understanding. Daksh walked over to a shelf where several of Jay's early pieces were still stored, pots he had made during his apprenticeship that Daksh had deemed not quite ready for sale. "Look at this bowl," Daksh said, picking up one of Jay's earlier attempts. "What do you see now that you didn't see then?" Jay examined the bowl with his newly educated eyes. "The wall is too thin on one side. The base is slightly off-center. The rim wavers." "Yes. And when I pointed out these flaws 8 months ago, what did you think?" "I thought you were being too picky. I thought it was good enough." "And now?" Jay was quiet for a long moment. "Now I see that you were right. It would have cracked in firing. The thin wall would never have held glaze properly." Daksh set the bowl down gently. "You thought I was criticizing you, Jay, but I was never criticizing you. I was criticizing your work. Isn't that the same thing?" "No." Daksh's voice was firm, but not unkind. "You are not your work. You are the one who creates the work. If your work has flaws, that doesn't mean you are flawed. It means your skills need development." He gestured toward Jay's failed attempts from his independent months. "The clay doesn't care about your feelings," Daksh continued. "It doesn't care if you think criticism is too harsh or not harsh enough. It will crack if the walls are uneven. It will warp if the base is not true. It will fail if the technique is incorrect. The clay only responds to skill, not to hope or pride or hurt feelings. Jay stared at his failed pots, understanding beginning to dawn. When I pointed out flaws in your work, Daksh said, I was teaching you to see what the clay sees. I was training your eyes to catch problems before they became failures. I was hard on your work so that the clay would not have to be harder on it. But it felt like you were criticizing me personally, Jay protested. I know. That's because you were identifying yourself with your work instead of seeing yourself as separate from it. You thought that imperfect work meant you were an imperfect person. Daksh picked up a lump of fresh clay and began centering it on the wheel. Watch my hands, he said. Do you see how I guide the clay firmly? How I don't accept wobbles or unevenness? Am I being harsh to the clay? No, Jay said, watching the clay respond to Daksh's confident touch. You're just working with its nature. Exactly. And when clay misbehaves, when it collapses or goes off center, do I take it personally? Do I think the clay is trying to hurt my feelings? Jay almost smiled. No, you just start over. Yes, because I understand that the clay is not trying to please me or displease me. It's just responding to the forces I apply to it. If I want different results, I must apply different forces. Daksh's hands moved up the clay, creating perfect walls and smooth, confident motions. This is what I was trying to teach you, he said. Not to take technique personally, but to understand it objectively. When your work failed, it wasn't because you were a failure. It was because the technique was imperfect. But you couldn't learn to perfect the technique as long as you thought criticism of the technique was criticism of you. Jay watched his master work, seeing with new eyes not just the skill in those hands, but the years of criticism and correction and failure that had shaped that skill. Were you hard on your own work when you were learning? Jay asked. Harder than I was on yours, Daksh replied. My master was even more demanding than I am. He made me remake the same pot 20 times once, just to teach me about centering. How did you bear it? I learned to separate myself from my work. I learned that a pot could be terrible while I remained worthy of teaching. I learned that criticism of my technique was not rejection of my personhood. The pot on the wheel had become a perfect bowl, its walls even and true, its rim centered and smooth. The deepest teaching in pottery, Daksh said, lifting the bowl from the wheel, is not about clay at all. It's about ego. The clay will teach you everything you need to know about technique if you can get your ego out of the way long enough to listen. Jay stood quietly, absorbing this lesson that went far beyond pottery. Master, he said finally, would you be willing to teach me again? To criticize my work as harshly as it needs to be criticized? Daksh smiled. The first smile Jay could remember seeing from him. I never stopped teaching you, he said. Even when you left, I was teaching you. Sometimes the best teacher is failure itself when it comes at the right time. And now? Now you're ready to learn. Because now you understand that when I point out flaws in your work, I'm not attacking you. I'm helping you see what you need to see to improve. Jay picked up a lump of clay and moved toward the wheel, his hands trembling slightly with nervousness and excitement. Be very critical, he said to his master. Don't spare my feelings. I won't criticize your feelings, Daksh replied. They don't affect the clay. I'll only criticize your technique, and I'll be as precise and demanding as the clay requires. For the first time in months, Jay began to center clay on the wheel. Within moments, Daksh spoke up. Your pressure is uneven. The clay is fighting you. But this time, instead of feeling criticized, Jay felt guided. The words were pointing him toward success, not away from it. "Thank you, Master," he said, adjusting his touch. The clay responded, becoming smooth and centered under his hands. This story shows us that criticism of our work is not rejection of our worth. Jay discovered that his master had been hard on his pottery, not on him as a person, teaching him to see flaws before they became failures. Buddhism teaches that suffering often comes from identifying our sense of self with things that are not self: our work, our achievements, our temporary roles. When we can separate our inherent worth from our performance, we become free to improve our performance without defending our ego. Let us pause here and rest for a moment. Feel your breath moving gently in and out, asking nothing of you except to be present with this natural rhythm. Notice how your body breathes without any criticism or judgment. It simply does what it knows how to do. This is the wisdom we can bring to all our learning: presence without defensiveness, openness without attachment to results. Our next story takes us to a different kind of learning, where a woman discovered that the roles we play can become prisons when we forget we are not the same as the parts we perform. In a household where 3 generations lived under one roof, there was a woman named Priya who had spent 15 years being the perfect daughter-in-law. She rose before dawn to prepare tea for her husband's parents, spent her days managing the household, cooking elaborate meals, maintaining the family's social obligations, and caring for everyone's needs before her own. Priya was known throughout the neighborhood as an exemplary wife and daughter-in-law. Visitors would comment on how fortunate her in-laws were to have such a devoted woman in their family. Her own mother would point to her as an example for younger women. "See how Priya has mastered the art of family harmony," she would say. "This is how a woman should conduct herself." And Priya had indeed mastered this art. She knew exactly how her mother-in-law liked her tea prepared, could anticipate her father-in-law's moods, and adjust the household rhythm accordingly, managed to keep her husband content while maintaining peace between him and his parents. She had become expert at reading the subtle signs of family tension and smoothing them before they could develop into conflicts. But somewhere in her 33rd year, as she stood in the kitchen preparing the morning meal, as she had done thousands of times before, Priya felt something she had never felt before. A deep, aching tiredness that seemed to come not from her body, but from somewhere deeper. She paused in her chopping of vegetables and looked around the familiar kitchen, at the stove where she had cooked countless meals, at the shelves she had organized and reorganized, at the window where she had stood so many mornings, watching the sun rise while her hands moved automatically through their familiar tasks. For just a moment, she could not remember who she had been before she became this person, this perfect daughter-in-law, this manager of everyone else's needs, this woman whose own desires had become so buried she was not sure they still existed. The feeling passed quickly, pushed away by the familiar rhythm of her duties. The vegetables needed chopping, the chapatis needed rolling, the family needed feeding. There was no time for strange moments of disconnection, no space for questioning a life that everyone agreed was exemplary. But the feeling returned the next morning, and the next, a sense of being lost inside her own life, of playing a role so completely that she had forgotten there was anyone beneath the performance. Priya began to notice things she had not paid attention to before. How she never sat down to eat until everyone else had been served and was satisfied. How she had not read a book or listened to music or taken a walk for pleasure in years. How she could not remember the last time someone had asked her what she wanted, or even the last time she had asked herself. She realized that if someone were to ask her to describe herself, not her roles, not her duties, but herself, she would not know what to say. She was a wife, a daughter-in-law, a household manager, a keeper of family harmony. But beneath these roles, who was she? The question troubled her because she could not answer it, and it troubled her more because she felt guilty for asking it. Wasn't a woman supposed to find fulfillment in serving her family? Wasn't this the path to a meaningful life that she had been taught since childhood? One evening, as she was cleaning up after dinner while the family watched television in the next room, Priya's mother-in-law came into the kitchen. "Beta," the older woman said, using the affectionate term for daughter. "You look tired lately. Are you feeling well?" Priya paused in her washing of dishes. Her mother-in-law was not an unkind woman, and her concern seemed genuine. "I'm fine, Ma," Priya replied automatically. "Just a little tired, perhaps." "You work so hard for all of us," her mother-in-law continued. "Sometimes I wonder if we ask too much of you." For a moment, Priya felt a flash of something, hope, perhaps, or relief that someone had noticed. But then her mother-in-law continued, "But you know, this is what makes a family strong. When the women understand their dharma, their duty, the whole household thrives. You are setting such a good example for the younger women in our community." The moment of possibility closed like a door. Priya nodded and smiled. "Thank you, Ma. I'm honored to serve the family." That night, lying beside her sleeping husband, Priya stared at the ceiling and wondered when she had become a stranger to herself. She loved her family, truly. But she was beginning to suspect that somewhere along the way, she had disappeared into her love for them, had become so identified with taking care of others that she had forgotten how to take care of herself. The next day brought an unexpected visitor, a cousin of Priya's who had moved to the city years ago and whom the family rarely saw. Mira was a teacher, unmarried by choice, independent in ways that made the family slightly uncomfortable, but too polite to criticize openly. "Priya," Mira exclaimed as she entered the house. "It's so wonderful to see you. How are you? What are you doing these days?" The question caught Priya off guard. What was she doing these days? The same thing she had been doing for 15 years. "Oh, you know," she replied vaguely. "Taking care of the family, managing the household." "Yes, but what about you? What are you interested in? What do you do for yourself?" Priya felt a flush of embarrassment. "Well, the family keeps me quite busy." Mira studied her with intelligent eyes. "Do you remember when we were children, how you used to write poetry? You had such a beautiful way with words. Are you still writing?" Poetry. Priya had a sudden, vivid memory of herself at 18, sitting under the neem tree in her parents' courtyard, filling notebook after notebook with verses about the changing seasons, the calls of birds, the way light fell across water. She had dreamed of perhaps publishing her poems someday, of sharing her observations of the world through carefully chosen words. "No," she said quietly, "I haven't written poetry in years. There's no time for such things now." "That's such a shame," Mira said. "You had real talent. I still remember the poem you wrote about the monsoon, about rain washing the dust from leaves so they could breathe again." Priya remembered that poem. She remembered the feeling of finding exactly the right words to capture something she had observed, the satisfaction of creating something beautiful from the raw material of experience. That evening, after the dishes were cleaned and the family had settled into their evening routines, Priya found herself looking for the notebooks where she had once written her poetry. She discovered them finally, buried deep in a trunk in the storage room, covered with dust and barely visible beneath years of accumulated household items. She opened one notebook and found herself reading poems she had forgotten she had written. The handwriting was hers, but younger, more confident somehow. The voice in the poems was recognizably hers, but different, more curious, more willing to question and wonder, more interested in her own perceptions and feelings. As she read, Priya felt as if she were meeting someone she had once known well, but had lost touch with completely. The young woman who had written these poems had opinions, had questions, had a particular way of seeing the world that was uniquely hers. What had happened to that woman? The next morning, Priya woke earlier than usual and, instead of going immediately to the kitchen, sat for a few minutes with one of her old notebooks. She read a poem about the way morning light transformed ordinary objects into things of beauty, making them seem to glow from within. When had she last really looked at morning light? When had she last noticed the way it fell across the kitchen counter, or the way it made the brass pots gleam, or the way it created patterns of shadow and brightness on the wall? She looked up from the notebook and really saw the room around her, as if for the first time in years. The early light was indeed beautiful, transforming the familiar kitchen into something almost magical. How had she stopped noticing this? "Good morning, Beta," her mother-in-law said, entering the kitchen. "You're up even earlier than usual today." "Good morning, Ma," Priya replied, closing the notebook quickly and rising to begin her morning tasks. But something had shifted. As she moved through her familiar routine, she found herself noticing things: the sound of the tea boiling, the texture of the dough as she kneaded it, the way steam rose from the hot chapatis. It was as if reading her old poems had awakened something in her that had been asleep. Over the following days, Priya began to have a strange double experience. Part of her continued to perform her duties with the same efficiency and care she always had. But another part of her, a part that felt newly awakened, began to observe her life as if from a distance. She noticed how automatically she moved through her tasks, how rarely she paused to consider whether she wanted to do something or was simply doing it out of habit. She noticed how often she asked others what they needed, but never asked herself. She noticed how she had become so skilled at anticipating everyone else's desires that she had forgotten how to recognize her own. One afternoon, while her mother-in-law was napping and her husband was at work, Priya found herself with an unexpected hour of free time. Normally, she would use such time to catch up on household tasks, organizing closets, preparing vegetables for the evening meal, mending clothes. Instead, she found herself sitting in the small garden behind the house with one of her old notebooks and a pen she had not used in years. She tried to write, to capture her observations and feelings as she had done so long ago. But the words felt clumsy, unfamiliar. It was as if she had forgotten not just the practice of writing, but the permission to have thoughts and feelings worth recording. After struggling with several false starts, she finally wrote a simple sentence: "I am 33 years old and I do not know who I am." The honesty of it startled her. She stared at the words, feeling exposed and vulnerable. But she also felt a small spark of recognition. This was her voice, tentative and uncertain perhaps, but authentically hers. Over the following weeks, she began to write regularly during these stolen moments of privacy. Not poetry at first, but simple observations, questions, fragments of thought. She wrote about the feeling of being lost in her own life. She wrote about the difference between loving others and losing herself in that love. She wrote about the fear that if she stopped being the perfect daughter-in-law, she might discover there was nothing underneath. Gradually, through this practice of paying attention to her own thoughts and feelings, Priya began to sense a self beneath her roles, tentative and uncertain, but real. She began to remember things about herself that had nothing to do with her duties, that she loved the sound of rain on leaves, that she was curious about the birds that visited the garden, that she had always wondered what it would be like to travel to the mountains. These discoveries felt both thrilling and dangerous. What would happen if she started expressing preferences, having desires, taking up space in conversations? What would happen if she stopped being the perfectly accommodating woman everyone expected her to be? The crisis came during the festival season, when Priya's household traditionally hosted an elaborate celebration for the extended family and community. As always, the responsibility for organizing everything fell to her, planning the menu, coordinating with other family members, managing the cooking and serving and cleaning. But this year, as she threw herself into the familiar preparations, Priya felt a growing sense of disconnection from her own actions. She was performing the role of the devoted hostess with perfect skill, but she felt like an actor in a play she no longer wanted to be in. The evening of the celebration, as she moved through the crowded house ensuring everyone was fed and comfortable, Priya overheard a conversation between two elderly women. "Look how beautifully Priya manages everything," one was saying. "She's completely selfless. She never thinks of her own needs." "Yes," the other agreed. "She's completely devoted to others. She has no ego at all." The words hit Priya like a physical blow. They were meant as compliments, she knew, but they felt like a description of someone who had ceased to exist. Was this really what she had become? A woman with no ego, no self, no desires of her own? That night, after the last guest had left and the house was cleaned and quiet, Priya sat alone in the garden with her notebook. Her hands trembling slightly, she wrote, "I have become so good at being what others need that I have forgotten how to be what I am. I have disappeared so completely into my roles that I am not sure I exist anymore. I love my family, but I am afraid I have loved them at the expense of loving myself." As she wrote these words, Priya felt as if she were admitting to some terrible failure. Wasn't selflessness supposed to be a virtue? Wasn't devotion to family the highest calling for a woman? But she also felt a spark of something she had not felt in years. The conviction that her own thoughts and feelings mattered, that her own existence was valuable not just for what it provided others, but for itself. The next morning brought another visit from her cousin Mira, who was passing through town again on her way to a teaching conference. "Priya," Mira said as they sat together over tea, "I've been thinking about you since my last visit. You seem, I don't know how to put this, like you're not quite present in your own life." Priya looked at her cousin's concerned face. "What do you mean?" "It's like you're so busy being the perfect daughter-in-law, the perfect wife, the perfect hostess, that you've forgotten to be Priya. When I ask you what you think about something, you tell me what your husband thinks or what your in-laws think. When I ask what you want, you tell me what the family needs." Priya felt tears prick her eyes. "But that's what a good wife does, isn't it? Put family first?" "Of course, family is important," Mira said gently. "But you're part of the family too. Your thoughts and feelings and needs matter too. You can love others without disappearing into that love. But everyone says I'm a good example of how a woman should be. And maybe you are. But the question is, are you a good example of how Priya should be?" The question lingered in the air between them like incense smoke. "I don't even know who Priya is anymore," Priya admitted quietly. "Then maybe it's time to find out," Mira said. That afternoon, after Mira had left, Priya sat in her garden with her notebook. But instead of writing, she simply sat and asked herself a question she had not asked in years. What do I want? The question felt foreign, almost shocking. For so long, The only wants that had mattered were other people's wants. Her husband's preference for certain foods, her mother-in-law's need for a quiet house in the afternoons, her father-in-law's desire for his newspaper to be placed just so on his chair each morning. But what did she want? At first, only silence answered the question. Then, gradually, small answers began to emerge. She wanted to write again. She wanted to read books that interested her, not just the household management magazines her mother-in-law passed along. She wanted to have conversations about ideas, not just about meal planning and family gossip. She wanted to take walks in the early morning when the air was cool and the world was quiet. These desires felt both precious and dangerous. What would happen if she started pursuing them? What would happen if she began to take up space in her own life? This story shows us that we can become so identified with our roles that we forget we are not the same as the parts we play. Priya discovered that losing herself in service to others, no matter how well-intentioned, created a subtle form of suffering for everyone involved. Buddhism teaches that when we cling too tightly to any identity, even positive ones like devoted wife or perfect daughter-in-law, we limit our ability to respond authentically to life's changing circumstances. Let your breath deepen now, naturally and without effort. Notice that with each breath, you are both the same person you have always been and subtly different from the person you were a moment ago. This is the dance of identity, continuous and changing, rooted and flowing, like a river that is always itself while never containing the same water twice. Our final story tonight takes us to a monastery kitchen where a cook discovered that even spiritual practice can become another form of attachment when we mistake the method for the destination. In the kitchen of a mountain monastery, where the air was thin and clean and the silence broken only by the sound of chopping vegetables and bubbling pots, there worked a monk named Tenzin who had devoted his life to feeding his spiritual brothers. Tenzin had been the monastery cook for 12 years, ever since arriving as a young man seeking escape from a world that had seemed too chaotic, too demanding, too full of suffering he could not understand. The monastery had offered what he sought: order, purpose, a clear path toward enlightenment through service and meditation. His days followed a rhythm as regular as breathing. He rose at 4 a.m. for meditation, then spent the hours until noon preparing meals for the 43 monks who lived in the monastery. After the midday meal, he cleaned the kitchen thoroughly, then spent the afternoon in study and personal practice. Evenings brought more meditation, and then sleep in his simple cell. Tenzin took deep satisfaction in his work. He had learned to prepare simple vegetarian meals that nourished both body and spirit. He could judge by the sound exactly when the rice was perfectly cooked, could tell by the fragrance when the lentils needed more time or less heat. He had memorized the preferences of each monk, who needed extra ginger for digestion, who was allergic to certain spices, who required smaller portions due to age or illness. More than this, Tenzin had learned to cook with meditation, to make food preparation itself a spiritual practice. He would chop vegetables with complete mindfulness, paying attention to each slice, each movement of the knife. He would stir pots with loving kindness, infusing the food with intentions for the health and happiness of those who would eat it. He had read that the consciousness of the cook entered the food, and he worked to ensure that only peace and compassion flavored his dishes. Other monks praised his dedication. The abbot would often comment on how Tenzin had transformed simple ingredients into meals that seemed to carry blessing with them. Visitors to the monastery would remark on the unusual satisfaction they felt after eating food prepared with such mindful attention. Tenzin felt proud of his spiritual progress. He had found his path, had discovered how to turn mundane work into sacred practice. He was no longer the confused young man who had arrived at the monastery gates 12 years ago. He was a practitioner, a contributor to the spiritual life of the community, someone who had learned to find the divine in the ordinary. But in his 13th year at the monastery, something began to shift. Tenzin started to notice that his satisfaction in his work was becoming mixed with something else, a subtle anxiety about maintaining his reputation as the mindful cook, a worry about whether his meditation while cooking was deep enough, a concern about whether he was making adequate spiritual progress through his kitchen practice. He found himself comparing his spiritual state from day to day. On days when he felt particularly centered while cooking, when his mindfulness seemed steady and his loving kindness felt genuine, he would feel proud of his achievement. On days when his mind wandered during food preparation, when he found himself rushing through tasks or feeling irritated by small problems, he would worry that he was falling behind in his practice. Gradually, Tenzin realized he had begun to treat his kitchen work as a kind of spiritual performance, judging each day's cooking not just by whether the food was nourishing and well prepared, but by whether his own consciousness during preparation met his standards for proper meditation. The irony was not lost on him. He had become attached to his non-attachment, ego invested in his ego-lessness, spiritually proud of his humility. The very practice that was supposed to free him from the trap of self-centered thinking had become another form of self-centered thinking. This recognition troubled him deeply. If even his sincere spiritual practice could become a source of ego gratification, what hope did he have of genuine progress? If he could turn cooking into another form of performance anxiety, was he capable of any truly selfless action? One morning, as Tenzin was preparing the breakfast porridge with his usual careful attention, monitoring his mindfulness, checking his intentions, trying to maintain the perfect balance of concentration and loving kindness, disaster struck. A pot of milk boiled over, spilling across the stove and creating a sticky, burned mess. Distracted by cleaning this up, Tenzin let the porridge scorch on the bottom of its pot. While dealing with the scorched porridge, he forgot about the tea steeping on the side table, which became bitter from overbrewing. In the space of 20 minutes, Tenzin had created a breakfast that was barely edible, and a kitchen that smelled of burned milk and scorched grain. Worse yet, he had done this while supposedly practicing mindful cooking, while supposedly infusing the food with peaceful consciousness. As the monks filed into the dining hall and discovered the ruined breakfast, Tenzin felt waves of shame and failure wash over him. He had let down the community. He had failed in his practice. He had proven himself to be not the mindful cook everyone thought he was, but just another distracted, incompetent person making mistakes. The abbot, an elderly man whose compassion was legendary throughout the region, appeared in the kitchen doorway as Tenzin was frantically trying to clean up the mess. "Tenzin," the abbot said gently, "what happened here?" "I'm sorry, Rinpoche," Tenzin said, using the respectful title for his teacher. "I was trying to practice mindfulness while cooking, but I got distracted and ruined everything. I've failed in my practice." The abbot stepped into the kitchen, surveying the burned pots and spilled milk with interest rather than criticism. "Tell me about this mindfulness practice of yours," he said. Tenzin explained his method, how he tried to maintain perfect attention while cooking, how he worked to infuse the food with loving intentions, how he used kitchen work as meditation practice. The abbot listened without interruption, occasionally nodding. When Tenzin finished, the older man was quiet for a moment, seeming to consider what he had heard. "This sounds like very sincere practice," he said finally. "Tell me, when you are cooking with such careful mindfulness, who is being mindful? The question puzzled Tenzin. I am, Rinpoche. I am practicing mindfulness. Ah, and when you are infusing the food with loving kindness, who is doing the infusing? I am. I see. And when you succeed in maintaining perfect attention while cooking, who feels proud of this success? Tenzin began to see where this was leading. I do. And when you fail to maintain perfect attention, who feels ashamed? I do. The abbot smiled gently. So this mindful cooking practice of yours, it seems to involve a great deal of I, doesn't it? Tenzin felt as if a door had opened in his understanding. Yes, Rinpoche. I think I've been practicing mindfulness in order to be a good practitioner rather than just practicing mindfulness. And what is the difference? Tenzin thought carefully. When I'm trying to be a good practitioner, I'm focused on my performance, on whether I'm doing it right, on what others will think. When I'm just practicing mindfulness, I'm focused on what I'm actually doing. Yes. And when you burned the breakfast this morning, were you focused on what you were actually doing? No, Tenzin admitted. I was focused on monitoring my own mindfulness, on making sure I was practicing correctly. I was more interested in my spiritual state than in the actual cooking. The abbot picked up one of the burned pots and examined it with interest. Tell me, Tenzin, what does this pot need right now? It needs to be cleaned, Rinpoche. Yes. And does the pot care whether you clean it with perfect mindfulness or imperfect mindfulness? No. It just needs to be clean. Exactly. The pot has no opinion about your spiritual state. It only responds to whether you actually clean it or not. The abbot set down the pot and looked at Tenzin with eyes full of kindness. You have been trying to use cooking as a spiritual practice, he said. But perhaps cooking is already a spiritual practice, whether you try to make it one or not. Perhaps the spirituality is not something you add to the cooking, but something that emerges naturally when you simply cook with complete attention to cooking. Tenzin felt something shift in his understanding, like clouds parting to reveal sky that had always been there. Are you saying I should stop trying to practice mindfulness while cooking? I'm saying you might try cooking for the sake of cooking, rather than cooking for the sake of practicing mindfulness. Let the mindfulness take care of itself. But then how will I make spiritual progress? The abbot smiled. What if spiritual progress is not something you make, but something that happens when you stop trying to make it? What if the very effort to improve yourself spiritually is what prevents you from discovering what you already are? That evening, Tenzin returned to the kitchen to prepare the evening meal. But instead of setting up his usual framework of mindfulness practice, he simply began cooking. He chopped vegetables because the vegetables needed chopping. He stirred pots because the food needed stirring. He seasoned dishes because they needed seasoning. When his mind wandered, he didn't judge the wandering or try to force it back to perfect attention. He simply noticed where his mind had gone and gently returned his attention to the task at hand. To his surprise, the meal came together with an ease he had not experienced in months. Without the constant self-monitoring and performance anxiety, he found himself naturally more present to what he was actually doing. The food seemed to cook itself while he simply provided the necessary attention and care. The monks commented on how delicious the evening meal was, how satisfying and nourishing it felt. But more importantly, Tenzin felt a deep sense of peace that came not from having performed his spiritual practice correctly, but from having simply done what needed to be done with complete presence. After cleaning up the kitchen that night, Tenzin sat in meditation in his cell. But again, instead of trying to meditate in order to achieve some spiritual goal, he simply sat. He didn't monitor the quality of his practice or judge his mental states or worry about his progress. He just sat, allowing whatever arose in his mind to arise and pass away naturally. In that simple sitting without agenda, without self-improvement project, without spiritual ambition, Tenzin touched something he had been seeking for 12 years without finding. Not enlightenment as he had imagined it, not some special state of consciousness, but the profound ordinariness of just being present without trying to be anything else. The next morning, as he prepared breakfast with the same natural attention he had discovered the night before, Tenzin understood that all his years of spiritual practice had been valuable, but not in the way he had thought. They had been like learning the alphabet, so that eventually he could forget about letters and simply read. They had taught him the skills he needed, so that eventually he could stop trying to be spiritual and just be present. This story shows us how spiritual practice itself can become a subtle form of attachment when we focus more on being good practitioners than on simply being present. Tenzin discovered that even sincere efforts at mindfulness could become another form of self-centered performance when the ego co-opts the practice for its own validation. Buddhism teaches that the deepest freedom comes not from perfecting our spiritual techniques, but from letting go of the need to be spiritual at all, allowing natural awareness to emerge when we stop trying to manufacture it. Rest now for a moment. Let your breath move as it wishes to move, without any guidance or improvement from you. Feel how your body knows exactly how to breathe, how to rest, how to be alive without any effort from your thinking mind. This natural functioning, requiring no spiritual technique or self-improvement, points to the very awareness that all practices ultimately hope to reveal. We have traveled through many stories tonight. Stories of a temple keeper who learned that hoarding resources prevents their purpose. A young widow who discovered that love multiplies rather than diminishes when shared. A landowner who found that true security comes through community rather than isolation. An apprentice who learned to separate his worth from his work. A woman who began to remember herself beneath her roles. And a monk who found that the deepest practice is no practice at all. In each story, we have seen the same pattern. Someone holding tightly to something they believed was protecting them, only to discover that the very holding was creating the suffering they sought to avoid. The temple keeper's careful conservation dimmed his temple. The widow's loyalty to the past threatened to waste her future. The landowner's self-protection isolated him when he most needed community. The apprentice's identification with his work prevented him from learning. The daughter-in-law's perfect service erased her authentic self. The monk's spiritual ambition obscured the natural awareness he sought. This is the fundamental teaching about attachment that threads through all Buddhist wisdom. That clinging, even to good things, even to spiritual things, creates the very bondage we are trying to escape. But our stories have also shown us something else. That letting go does not mean not caring, does not mean becoming passive or indifferent. The temple keeper's generosity with oil created more light and more community support. The widow's openness to new love honored rather than betrayed her first marriage. The landowner's sharing of his abundance strengthened the security he sought. The apprentice's acceptance of criticism accelerated his learning. The woman's reclaiming of her authentic self could serve her family more fully. The monk's natural presence created better meals and deeper peace than all his spiritual striving. This is the paradox that lies at the heart of Buddhist teaching. When we stop grasping, we gain access to everything we were grasping for. When we stop defending, we find true security. When we stop performing, we discover authentic being. When we stop trying to control outcomes, we gain the ability to respond appropriately to whatever arises. Let us explore one more story tonight, one that brings together all these themes in the form of a question that comes to every sincere seeker. How do we live with wisdom in a world that seems to require us to grasp and defend and perform constantly? Take a gentle breath and let yourself settle deeper into rest. Our final story takes us to a marketplace where all the lessons we have learned tonight will meet in the life of one person facing a choice that will test everything she thinks she knows about letting go. In a bustling market town where merchants called their wares from morning till evening and the streets were always full of people seeking what they needed, there lived a woman named Anjali who had spent 3 years studying with a wise teacher in the mountains. She had learned about non-attachment, about the suffering that comes from clinging, about the freedom that emerges when we let go of our desperate need to control outcomes. Her time with the teacher had transformed her understanding of life. She had practiced meditation until she could sit in perfect stillness for hours. She had studied the teachings until she could recite the principles of non-attachment with clarity and conviction. She had worked to release her grip on desires and expectations and had experienced the peace that comes when the mind stops its constant reaching and grasping. Now, at 28, Anjali had returned to the world to put her understanding into practice. She had opened a small shop in the marketplace where she sold simple handmade goods, pottery from local artisans, woven cloth from village women, herbs and teas from the mountain regions. She tried to run her business according to Buddhist principles, treating customers with loving kindness, pricing goods fairly, maintaining equanimity whether business was good or slow. Anjali felt proud of her ability to remain detached from the ups and downs of commerce. When customers bargained hard, she practiced patience. When competitors undercut her prices, she reminded herself that attachment to profit was the root of suffering. When rainy days kept people away from the market, she used the quiet time for meditation, grateful for the opportunity to practice non-reactivity. Her teacher would have been proud, she thought. She had successfully integrated spiritual wisdom into daily life, had learned to live with the open hand rather than the clenched fist. But in her 4th month back in the marketplace, Anjali faced a situation that would test her understanding more deeply than any amount of meditation or study had prepared her for. Her younger brother Vikram arrived at her shop one morning, his face drawn with worry, his clothes dusty from traveling all night from their home village. "Didi," he said, using the respectful term for elder sister, "I need your help, desperately." Anjali looked at her brother's exhausted face with concern. Vikram was 23, married for 2 years, trying to establish himself as a farmer on the small plot of land their father had left him. He was a good man, but impractical, given to enthusiasms that faded when faced with hard work. "What's wrong?" she asked, setting aside the account books she had been working on. Vikram glanced around the shop, then moved closer to speak quietly. "I've made a terrible mistake," he said. "You know how I've been trying to expand the farm, to plant more profitable crops?" Anjali nodded. Vikram had written to her about his plans to switch from growing basic grains to growing cash crops like saffron and cardamom that could bring higher prices at market. "I borrowed money," Vikram continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "A lot of money, from a moneylender in the next district. I was sure the cardamom harvest would pay for everything and leave us comfortable for years." Anjali felt a cold sensation in her stomach. She could guess what was coming. "The rains came too early this year," Vikram said. "They ruined the cardamom before it could be harvested. The entire crop was lost. And now," he swallowed hard, "the moneylender wants his money back, with interest. If I don't pay him within 2 weeks, he'll take the land. Priya and I will have nothing. Worse than nothing, we'll be in debt with no way to repay it." Anjali closed her eyes briefly, feeling the weight of her brother's desperation. She had saved money carefully during her years with the teacher and had added to her savings since opening the shop. She had enough to pay off Vikram's debt, but it would take nearly everything she had accumulated. "How much do you need?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. Vikram named a sum that made Anjali's breath catch. It was indeed almost everything she had saved, the security she had built for herself, the foundation that allowed her to run her shop without constant worry about money. "Didi, I know it's a lot," Vikram said, seeing her expression. "But you're the only person I can ask, the only person who might have such a sum." Anjali looked at her brother's face, seeing not just his desperation, but his shame at having to ask for help, his fear of losing everything he had worked for, his love for his young wife who would suffer along with him if he lost the land. "Of course," she said immediately. "Of course I'll help you." The relief on Vikram's face was so intense it was almost painful to see. "Thank you," he whispered. "I'll pay you back, I promise. Somehow I'll—" "Don't worry about that now," Anjali said, though even as she spoke, she knew that Vikram would likely never be able to repay such a sum. He was a sweet man, but not a practical one, and his pattern was to make enthusiastic plans that collapsed when faced with reality. That evening, after Vikram had left with a promissory note he could take to Anjali's bank in the morning, she sat alone in her small room above the shop, trying to understand what she was feeling. She had done the right thing, she was certain. Her brother was family, and he was in genuine need. Her teacher had always emphasized compassion, the importance of helping others, the spiritual value of generosity. She had acted according to Buddhist principles. So why did she feel so unsettled? As the days passed and the reality of her financial situation settled in, Anjali began to understand the complexity of what she had done. Yes, she had helped her brother from compassion, but she had also acted impulsively, without fully considering the consequences for herself or her business. With most of her savings gone, she could no longer afford to be relaxed about the daily ups and downs of the marketplace. She needed customers, she needed sales, she needed profit, not just to live comfortably, but to rebuild the financial security that had been lost. For the first time since opening her shop, Anjali found herself watching the door anxiously on slow days, found herself calculating profits and losses with urgent concern, found herself feeling disappointed when customers left without buying anything. All the equanimity she had cultivated, all the non-attachment she had practiced, seemed to evaporate in the face of genuine financial pressure. She was grasping again, grasping for customers, grasping for sales, grasping for the security she had given away. The irony was bitter. In trying to practice generosity and compassion, she had put herself back into the very condition of desperate attachment that her spiritual practice was supposed to free her from. Worse, she began to feel resentful, not toward Vikram exactly, but toward the situation, toward the unfairness of having to choose between her spiritual equanimity and her family loyalty. She had worked so hard to learn non-attachment, and now circumstances seemed to require attachment. She had cultivated inner peace, and now survival seemed to demand inner turmoil. A month after giving Vikram the money, Anjali received a letter from him that made her situation even more complicated. The moneylender had been satisfied, he wrote, and the land was safe. But Priya was pregnant, and the pregnancy was difficult, requiring expensive medical care. Could Anjali possibly lend a little more money, just to cover the doctor's fees? Anjali stared at the letter, feeling a complex mix of emotions. Joy for her brother and sister-in-law, who had wanted children for years. Anxiety about her own increasingly precarious financial situation. Guilt for feeling anxious about helping family in need. Anger at Vikram for asking for more money so soon. Shame at feeling angry about such a reasonable request. She had enough money left to cover the medical expenses, but doing so would leave her with barely enough to restock her shop. If business was slow for even a few weeks, she might not be able to pay her own rent. That night, Anjali sat in meditation for the first time in weeks, trying to find some clarity in the chaos of her emotions. But instead of the peace she used to find in sitting practice, she encountered only more confusion. Her mind raced between competing values, family duty and self-preservation, generosity and prudence, spiritual ideals and practical necessities. She found herself questioning everything she thought she had learned about non-attachment. Was true non-attachment supposed to make her indifferent to her own well-being? Was spiritual wisdom supposed to require financial foolishness? Was compassion supposed to leave her feeling anxious and resentful? The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. An elderly woman entered her shop, moving slowly but with dignity. Her white sari simple but clean, her eyes bright with intelligence. "Are you the young woman who studied with teacher Lobsang in the mountains?" the woman asked. Anjali was startled. Few people in the market town knew about her years of study. "Yes, I am. How did you know?" The woman smiled. "Word travels. My name is Kamala. I knew your teacher many years ago, before he established his retreat center. May I sit with you for a while?" Anjali brought a chair for her unexpected guest and made tea, grateful for any connection to her spiritual studies, especially during this time of confusion. "You seem troubled, child," Kamala observed as she accepted the tea. Something in the woman's manner, a quality of patient attention that reminded Anjali of her teacher, invited confidence. "I'm struggling to understand how to live wisely," Anjali admitted. "I learned about non-attachment during my studies, but when I try to apply it to real situations, everything becomes complicated." "Tell me about these complications," Kamala said, settling back in her chair as if she had all the time in the world. Anjali found herself pouring out the whole story. Her brother's financial crisis, her decision to give him nearly all her savings, the way this had thrown her back into anxiety about money, her recent request for more help, her confusion about what wisdom actually required in such situations. Kamala listened without interruption, occasionally nodding, her face reflecting deep attention, but no judgment. When Anjali finished, the older woman was quiet for a long moment, sipping her tea and looking thoughtfully around the small shop. "You know," Kamala said finally, "there's a story about your teacher that you might find helpful." "About teacher Lobsang?" "Yes. This was many years ago when he was still learning himself, studying with his own master in Tibet. There was a winter when food was very scarce in the monastery. The monks were subsisting on barely enough barley and tea to survive." Kamala set down her teacup and continued. "One day, a family arrived at the monastery gates, refugees fleeing from conflict in their region, traveling with small children and elderly grandparents. They were starving, near death from hunger and cold." Anjali listened intently. The young Lobsang immediately wanted to share the monastery's food with these travelers. He went to his teacher and argued that compassion required them to feed the family, even if it meant the monks would have even less to eat. "What did his teacher say?" His teacher asked him a question. If we give away our food and the monks become too weak to practice, too weak to maintain the monastery, too weak to help future travelers, have we acted with wisdom or just with emotion? Anjali frowned. That seems like a cruel question when people are starving. Does it? The teacher continued. And if we let this family die when we could save them, have we preserved anything worth preserving? So what did they do? Kamala smiled. They found a third option. They gave the family enough food to survive and continue their journey, but not so much that the monastery's own survival was threatened. They helped the travelers find other resources in nearby villages. They provided what assistance they could without destroying their ability to provide future assistance. But how do you know how much is enough? How do you know where to draw the line? Ah, said Kamala. That's the question that has no simple answer. That's where wisdom becomes an art rather than a rule. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes meeting Anjali's directly. You gave your brother almost all your savings because you wanted to practice generosity. But tell me honestly, was your giving motivated entirely by compassion for him? Or was it also motivated by your attachment to being a good person, a generous sister, a worthy student of Buddhist teaching? The question hit Anjali like a physical blow. She opened her mouth to protest, then closed it as she recognized the truth in what Kamala was suggesting. Both, she admitted quietly. I wanted to help him, truly. But I also wanted to prove to myself that I had learned something from my spiritual studies. I wanted to be the kind of person who gives without hesitation. Yes, so your giving was not entirely free from attachment, was it? You were attached to your identity as a generous person. Anjali felt tears prick her eyes. So I did it wrong? No, child. You did it humanly. The question is, what will you do now when your brother asks for more money? I don't know. If I give him more, I might not be able to keep my shop running. But if I don't give him more, his wife and unborn child might suffer. Kamala was quiet for a moment, watching a customer browse the pottery displays near the window. Let me ask you something different, she said. What would serve your brother best in the long term? Continuing to rescue him from the consequences of his poor decisions, or helping him learn to make better decisions? Anjali had not considered this angle. I think helping him learn. But how can I let his family suffer while he learns? Who says those are the only two options? What if there were a way to help his family without enabling his financial irresponsibility? What if there were a way to maintain compassion without destroying your own stability? I don't see how. Kamala stood and moved to examine some of the woven cloth hanging near the shop entrance. These are beautiful, she said, running her fingers over the fabric. Who makes them? Women from several villages in the mountains. I buy directly from them and sell here in town. So you're already creating a bridge between people who need income and people who appreciate their work. You're already practicing a form of generosity that doesn't impoverish anyone. Anjali had not thought of her business model in these terms, but she could see the truth in it. What if, Kamala continued, instead of giving your brother more money, you helped him find a way to earn what he needs? What if you used your connections, your knowledge of the marketplace, your business skills to help him create sustainable income rather than temporary rescue? He's a farmer, not a merchant, and he's not very practical about money. Then perhaps what he needs is not more money, but better guidance. Perhaps what would serve him best is not your cash, but your knowledge. Perhaps what his wife and child need most is not a father who is repeatedly rescued from his mistakes, but a father who learns to make better decisions. Anjali felt something shift in her understanding, like a knot loosening in her chest. "You're saying I can be compassionate without being enabling?" "I'm saying that true compassion sometimes requires us to let people face the consequences of their choices while offering appropriate support. I'm saying that wisdom means considering not just immediate needs, but long-term well-being. I'm saying that generosity doesn't require self-destruction." Kamala returned to her chair and picked up her tea. Non-attachment doesn't mean not caring, child. It means caring without being driven by fear or guilt or the need to prove something about yourself. It means responding to what's actually needed rather than what your emotions or ego demand. But how do I know what's actually needed? By looking clearly at the whole situation, not just the part that makes you feel guilty or proud. By considering everyone's well-being, including your own. By asking what would serve the highest good in the long term, not just what would relieve immediate discomfort. Anjali sat quietly, absorbing this teaching that felt both completely new and utterly familiar. "So when my brother asks for more money, you might say yes, or you might say no, or you might offer something else entirely. But whatever you do, you'll do it from clarity rather than from attachment to being seen as generous. You'll do it in service of genuine well-being rather than in service of your self-image as a good Buddhist." That evening, Anjali wrote a letter to her brother. Instead of sending money, she offered something else. She invited him to come stay with her for 2 weeks to learn about business, about planning, about managing money. She offered to introduce him to people who might buy his produce directly, cutting out middlemen who took too large a share of profits. She offered to help him develop a more sustainable approach to farming that didn't require risky borrowing. Most importantly, she offered to help him find resources in his own district for his wife's medical care, government programs for pregnant women, charitable organizations that assisted with difficult pregnancies, community support systems he might not have known about. As she wrote the letter, Anjali felt a peace she had not experienced since giving away her savings. This was not the peace of someone who had avoided a difficult decision, but the peace of someone who had found a way to be truly helpful rather than just temporarily rescuing. She was still acting from compassion, still offering assistance to family in need. But she was doing so in a way that preserved her own ability to continue helping in the future, and in a way that might actually serve her brother's long-term development, rather than just his immediate crisis. For the first time since returning from the mountains, Anjali understood that non-attachment and practical wisdom were not opposing forces, but complementary aspects of genuine compassion. True generosity, she realized, required not just an open heart, but also clear thinking. Real love sometimes meant saying no to immediate requests in service of deeper needs. As she sealed the letter, Anjali smiled, remembering her teacher's frequent reminder that the middle way was called middle, not because it was moderate or compromise, but because it transcended the extremes of indulgence and deprivation, of blind giving and selfish withholding. She had found her middle way, at least for now, and she understood, perhaps for the first time, that wisdom was not something she had learned once in the mountains and could now apply mechanically to every situation. Wisdom was something she would have to discover fresh in each moment, in each decision, in each opportunity, to respond to life with both love and clarity. The marketplace outside her window was growing quiet as vendors closed their stalls for the evening. But Anjali felt more awake than she had in weeks, alive to the complexity and richness of living wisely in a world that required both spiritual understanding and practical skillfulness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to practice the art of compassionate wisdom. But tonight, she rested in the satisfaction of having found a way to care for others that also cared for herself. To be generous without being foolish. To practice non-attachment that was engaged rather than withdrawn. This, she thought, might be what it actually meant to bring spiritual practice into daily life. Not the mechanical application of rules learned in retreat, but the creative discovery of how ancient wisdom could meet contemporary challenges with both love and intelligence. This story shows us that true compassion requires both an open heart and clear thinking. Anjali discovered that non-attachment doesn't mean avoiding difficult decisions, but making them from wisdom rather than from fear or the need to maintain a spiritual self-image. Buddhism teaches that the middle way is not compromise between extremes, but a path that transcends both selfish withholding and foolish enabling. When we act from genuine care for everyone's well-being, including our own, we find ways to help that truly serve rather than simply rescue. Let your breath flow naturally now, like water finding its course through varied terrain. Notice how breathing requires no philosophy, no spiritual technique, no decision about attachment or non-attachment. It simply flows according to what is needed, moment by moment, neither grasping nor rejecting, responding perfectly to the body's changing requirements. As we near the end of our journey together tonight, let us gather the threads of wisdom we have discovered. In the temple keeper's story, we saw that resources hoarded out of fear serve no one, while resources used for their true purpose create abundance. The young widow showed us that honoring the past doesn't require sacrificing the future, that love multiplies rather than diminishes when shared across a lifetime. The landowner learned that individual security and community well-being are not competing interests, but complementary aspects of true safety. The potter's apprentice discovered that criticism of work is not rejection of worth, that we can improve our skills without defending our ego. The devoted daughter-in-law began to remember that loving others doesn't require losing herself, that she could serve her family more authentically by remaining authentically herself. The monastery cook found that even spiritual practice can become a form of attachment when we focus more on being good practitioners than on simply being present. And finally, the merchant woman learned that wisdom in action requires both compassion and clarity, that true generosity considers long-term well-being rather than just immediate relief. Each story has shown us the same essential truth, that suffering comes not from life's difficulties, but from our attempts to grasp, control, and cling to things that are by nature impermanent and interdependent. Each character found freedom not by achieving perfect circumstances, but by changing their relationship to whatever circumstances arose. The temple keeper found abundance by releasing scarcity thinking. The widow found new love by releasing attachment to old forms. The landowner found security by releasing isolation. The apprentice found skill by releasing ego protection. The daughter-in-law found authenticity by releasing role identification. The monk found peace by releasing spiritual ambition. The merchant found wisdom by releasing the need to prove her generosity. In each case, the letting go was not a loss, but a liberation. Not an emptying, but a making space for something more wonderful than what had been grasped before. This is the heart of Buddhist understanding, that our happiness depends not on getting what we want, but on wanting what is. Not on controlling outcomes, but on responding wisely to whatever outcomes arise. Not on protecting ourselves from change, but on dancing with change as a partner rather than fighting it as an enemy. Take a moment now to feel the wisdom of your own body, which never clings to breath but lets each one flow naturally into the next. Feel how your heart beats without grasping at rhythms, how your blood flows without attachment to direction, how your cells constantly release what they no longer need and absorb what serves their current function. This natural wisdom of the body points to the natural wisdom of the mind when it is not caught in the webs of fear and desire, when it is not trying to freeze the flowing river of existence into manageable, controllable blocks. But perhaps the most important understanding we can take from tonight's journey is that this wisdom, this capacity to live with an open hand rather than a clenched fist, is not something we must achieve through years of struggle and practice. It is something we already are, underneath all the layers of conditioning and habit that teach us to grasp and defend and control. The temple keeper's generosity was not something foreign to his nature. It was the natural expression of abundance that emerged when fear was released. The widow's capacity for new love was not a betrayal of her first marriage. It was the flowering of everything that marriage had taught her about the beauty of sharing life with another. The landowner's community spirit was not a weakness. It was the recognition of his fundamental interdependence with all life. Each character discovered not something new, but something that had always been present, waiting to be uncovered like a jewel buried in mud, like clear water waiting beneath the surface of a muddy pond. This is what the Buddhist teachings call our Buddha nature, not something we must create or earn or perfect, but something we must simply stop covering over with our fears and desires and endless attempts to make life conform to our preferences. The deepest attachment, perhaps, is our attachment to the idea that we need to become something other than what we are. The deepest suffering might be the suffering of believing that happiness lies somewhere other than in this moment, in this breath, in this ordinary, extraordinary experience of being alive. Rest now in this understanding. Let your body sink deeper into whatever supports you. Feel how gravity holds you without effort, how the earth receives your weight without complaint, how the air around you provides exactly what you need without asking for payment or gratitude. This is how life supports you when you stop fighting with it, when you stop trying to make it other than what it is, when you allow yourself to be held by the vast intelligence that moves the stars and grows the trees and heals your wounds while you sleep. The stories we have shared tonight are not instructions for how to live, but reminders of how you already know how to live when you trust the deeper wisdom that moves beneath your thoughts and fears. They are mirrors reflecting back your own capacity for generosity, for love, for community, for learning, for authenticity, for presence. In the temple keeper, you see your own abundance waiting to be shared. In the young widow, you see your own capacity to honor the past while embracing the future. In the landowner, you see your own deep need for community. In the apprentice, you see your own ability to learn without defending your ego. In the daughter-in-law, you see your own longing to be authentic while still caring for others. In the monastery cook, you see your own natural awareness that needs no improvement. In the merchant woman, you see your own wisdom that can hold both compassion and clarity in perfect balance. These are not stories about other people, but stories about the different aspects of your own being, the different voices within your own heart, the different possibilities that exist within your own life. Breathe now with the knowing that you already contain everything you need for wisdom, for peace, for genuine happiness, not the happiness that depends on getting what you want, but the happiness that comes from recognizing the completeness of what you already are. Let your eyes close if they wish to close. Let your body settle more deeply into rest. There is nowhere you need to go, nothing you need to achieve, no one you need to become. This moment, exactly as it is the destination you have been seeking. This breath, exactly as it comes, is the practice you have been trying to perfect. This ordinary awareness, reading these words, receiving these thoughts, is the enlightenment you have been hoping to attain. The Buddha taught that all beings already possess Buddha nature, that enlightenment is not something rare and distant, but something ordinary and immediate. It is as close as your next breath, as available as your willingness to stop seeking it somewhere else. So rest now in your own Buddha nature, not as something you believe in or aspire to, but as the very awareness that is listening to these words, the very presence that is here in this moment, the very aliveness that requires no improvement or explanation or justification. This is what the temple keeper discovered when he stopped hoarding and started sharing. This is what the young widow found when she stopped protecting the past and opened to the future. This is what the landowner recognized when he stopped isolating and started connecting. This is what the apprentice understood when he stopped defending and started learning. This is what the daughter-in-law remembered when she stopped disappearing and started being present. This is what the monastery cook realized when he stopped trying to be spiritual and just allowed natural awareness to shine. It is what the merchant woman integrated when she learned to act from wisdom rather than from attachment to being wise. And it is what you can discover right now, not through any special technique or years of practice, but simply by relaxing into what you already are. This awareness, this presence, this capacity to receive life exactly as it comes without needing to improve it or change it or make it conform to your ideas about how it should be. The Vietnamese Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh taught that enlightenment is like the sun. It is always shining, always available, sometimes hidden by clouds but never actually absent. The clouds of confusion, of fear, of grasping, of trying to be someone other than who you are, can temporarily obscure this natural radiance, but they cannot extinguish it. Tonight, as you allow yourself to drift toward sleep, you can let these clouds dissolve naturally, not through effort or struggle, but through the gentle recognition that they were never solid to begin with. They were just thoughts, just habits of thinking, just old patterns of grasping and defending that you learned somewhere along the way, but that you can release as easily as you learned them. In sleep, the ego relaxes its constant vigilance. The mind stops its endless commentary. The body releases the tensions held during waking hours. What remains is pure awareness, pure being, the same Buddha nature that sages have pointed to for thousands of years, but that you can experience right now without becoming a sage or spending years in meditation retreat. This is the ultimate teaching of non-attachment. Not that you must give up everything you love, but that you can love everything you have without being enslaved by the need to keep it forever. Not that you must become indifferent to pleasure and pain, but that you can experience both fully without being defined by either. The temple keeper didn't stop caring about his temple when he learned to share his oil. He cared for it more completely, in a way that served its true purpose. The young widow didn't love her first husband less when she opened to new love. She honored his gift more fully by allowing it to bear fruit in new forms. The landowner didn't stop caring about his property when he shared his mangoes. He discovered what property actually means when it becomes part of community rather than separation from it. This is the freedom that comes with wisdom, not the freedom from caring, but the freedom to care without attachment, to love without possessiveness, to engage fully with life without being imprisoned by the need to control outcomes. As you rest now, allow yourself to experience this freedom. Let your breathing be completely natural, requiring no management from you. Let your heartbeat follow its own wisdom, needing no advice from your thinking mind. Let your body settle into whatever position brings comfort, trusting its intelligence to find rest without your conscious direction. This trust in natural processes, this willingness to let life live itself through you without constant interference, is a form of practice more profound than any technique. It is the practice of being rather than doing, of allowing rather than forcing, of receiving rather than grasping. In this state of natural being, insights arise by themselves. Wisdom appears not as something you think, but as something you are. Peace emerges not as an achievement, but as your natural condition when you stop disturbing it with efforts to create it. The stories we have shared tonight will continue to work in you as you sleep, like seeds planted in fertile soil. You may dream of temple lamps or fallen mangoes, of pottery wheels or monastery kitchens, or you may dream of completely different things, while the deeper teachings integrate themselves into your understanding without your conscious participation. This is how wisdom grows, not through intellectual analysis, but through a kind of osmosis, a gradual saturation of your being with truths that your deepest self already knows. The stories are just reminders, just ways of pointing your attention toward understanding that was always available, but perhaps temporarily forgotten. Like the merchant woman who learned that true generosity includes caring for herself, like the monastery cook who discovered that the deepest practice is no practice at all, you are learning to trust the wisdom that emerges when you stop trying so hard to be wise. Let this trust deepen now as you prepare for sleep. Trust that your body knows how to rest without your supervision. Trust that your mind knows how to release the day's concerns without your effort. Trust that your heart knows how to remain open even in vulnerability, how to love even in uncertainty, how to find peace even in the midst of an imperfect world. This is the ultimate non-attachment, not attachment to non-attachment, but simply the natural state that emerges when you stop attaching to anything, including the idea that you need to be non-attached. Sleep is approaching now, that daily practice of letting go, that nightly return to the source from which you emerged and to which you will eventually return. In sleep, you release control so completely that you don't even maintain awareness of releasing it. You trust so deeply that you disappear into trust itself. This is what the mystics call dying before death, the ego's voluntary dissolution into something larger, something that was there before you were born and will be there after you die. Something that you are more fundamentally than any role you play or any story you tell about yourself. As consciousness begins to fade into the soft darkness of sleep, you can rest in the knowing that this fading is not a loss, but a return. Not a diminishment, but an expansion into the vast spaciousness that is your true nature. The temple keeper found this spaciousness when he stopped hoarding and started sharing. The young widow discovered it when she stopped protecting the past and opened to the future. All of our characters tonight touched this same infinite space that is available to you right now, not as something you must seek, but as something you can recognize you have never actually left. Let the stories dissolve now into the silence from which they came. Let the words fade into the wordless understanding they were always pointing toward. Let the teaching become the lived reality of this moment, this breath, this gentle transition from waking to sleeping, from effort to ease, from grasping to grace. There is nothing left to do, nothing left to understand, nothing left to become. You are already home, already complete, already free. The seeking can end here, in this ordinary miracle of being alive, being aware, being exactly what you are without apology or improvement. Rest now in this truth. Let it hold you more gently than any pillow, more completely than any embrace. You are held by the same intelligence that holds the planets in their orbits and the seasons in their cycles, the same love that moves through every story of every person who has ever learned to let go and discovered what was always there, waiting beneath the grasping. Sleep well, knowing that you carry this wisdom in your very cells, this understanding in your very breath. Tomorrow will bring new opportunities to practice what you have learned tonight. New chances to choose trust over fear, openness over defensiveness, presence over the endless seeking for something better than what is. But tomorrow can take care of itself. Tonight, this moment is perfect exactly as it is, requiring nothing from you but your willingness to be here, to be present, to be yourself without the exhausting effort of trying to be someone else. The journey continues even as it ends. The path unfolds even as you arrive at your destination. This is the beautiful paradox of the spiritual life, that seeking and finding are not opposites but dance partners, that the goal is always present in the walking, that home is not a place you reach but a recognition of where you have always been. Rest now in this recognition. Let it carry you gently into sleep, into dreams, into the deep restoration that comes when you finally stop trying to hold yourself together and trust the greater wholeness that holds everything, including you, including all the stories we have shared, including this very moment of transition from waking consciousness into the vast mystery of sleep. Sleep well, and thank you for joining us at Sleepy Monk.